Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governance of Schools webinar. The focus on this morning's webinar is the governance of safeguarding in 2021. My name is Steve Barker, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda. Sorry, too many slides going forward there. I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn. Needless to say, that's me on the left and Linda on the right of the screen, and hopefully you can see us in glorious Technicolor live action as well. So, good morning, Linda.
Good morning, everyone.
And just a few housekeeping points. If we could ask you to please, if you have any questions, any comments throughout the session, then do actually use the Q&A facility to actually get those in front of us, and we'll do our level best to be able to respond to them for you. And I think you should all be able to see the live captioning option. So if you want to have the captions on, you can click that option on the, I think it's the bottom right of your screen, and that will actually put the captions up for you. Okay, so having done our brief introductions, I'm now going to hand over to Linda, who's actually going to take you through the first few slides.
So in this session this morning, what we'd like to do is to think about safeguarding from the starting point of the changes to the Keeping Children Safe in Education document, which has been updated from the 1st of September. And look at the implications for safeguarding in schools as a result of that. It's a very large document, and so we'll then focus our attention on those changes that governors and trustees need to know about, because this is from the compliance aspect, holding the school to account for ensuring that those changes have been incorporated into practice and policy at school. And then finally, we'll look at what best practice measures are suggested for boards, what you should be doing as governors and trustees as we move forward from this point of that new document being introduced. So let's think first of all about the Keeping Children Safe in Education. So we were working throughout the pandemic on an updated version of the 2020 document. There were in the past changes suggested, quite big changes for the document, and those now appear in the for the most part to have been incorporated into this new edition. Often we see an annual update to this in September. There have been occasions in previous years where it's been updated more than once. The document itself, I think it's fair to say the history of this document is based on all of the practice and cases of safeguarding that have occurred, and increases in our vigilance in schools, increases in the practices, the systems and processes that we need to put in place in order to better protect children throughout their time with us in our schools, is based, it finds its way into these documents. And so that's why they are updated at least annually, because then we can reflect on those changes. And it's fair to say that as we go through this 2021 edition with you today, you'll see that it does include some increases in safeguarding risks during the pandemic. So this is a process that if you've been a governor for some time, you'll be aware that this document exists, that it does inform practice, that it has a statutory nature. That's a must. And so it applies equally to all schools and academies to put these areas into practice. And this is the document which then both guides practice in schools, what happens on a day-to-day basis with staff, and also as a result of that, then our oversight as governors to ensure that those things have been updated, that those expectations are being met in full and reflect the context in which our school or academy operates.
And I think it's probably worth just mentioning, if we've got governors who perhaps are new to governance this year and you're not familiar with the document, we will use the term children throughout this, because from a safeguarding perspective, even though normally we might talk about children and young people, as far as safeguarding is concerned, the Children Act says that everybody is regarded as a child until they reach the age of 18. So we are talking about all children and young people in education. We're just using children as a generic term.
Thanks, Steve. So let's just take an overview of what we are considering when we are thinking about safeguarding as an umbrella term. And it is basically split into these 4 areas. Not going to go into any great detail in any of them, but you can see from the captions that are against the main headings there that physical abuse, by definition, includes those things that actually happen to a physical body of a child. Emotional abuse, these are signs that often can indicate that there are other things happening in a child's life, but they may have other aspects to them. So that low self-esteem and being unhappy or withdrawing, not having as many friends as maybe they had or were noted to have had before. Neglect, it is not just those very obvious signs of being unclean and untidy, but children who are often increasingly hungry and arrive late or are expected to make their way home from school on their own, which is not in common with maybe some of their peers. And then, of course, we've got that more troubling area of sexual abuse, which has some defined behaviours attached to it that should alert staff to the fact that there may be some further investigation to be done here. Now, with all of this terminology, there is greater detail in this booklet. There may be terminology and language that you haven't come across before, or you've heard the term but you don't know the detail, particularly for those of you that may be new to governance and education. But the document itself, it contains an annex. I think, Steve, you mentioned it was Annex B now. It used to be called Annex A. And that then gives you a lot more information about what the different areas of terminology means, so that we can, if our school is particularly in its context has a greater level of something, for example, where I'm chair, during the pandemic, we've seen a greater incident of domestic abuse. It's a term we might be familiar with, but the details of what that actually means, the annex provides some extra additional information that does help then build our knowledge of governance as what is the school facing, therefore what things need to be put in place to address that.
I think it's fair, but worth saying just before we move off this slide that, as Linda said, we put this in really just as an aid memoir. This is the reach of safeguarding. The only comment I would add on the emotional abuse is that none of these are anticipated to sort of operate in silos as such. And of course, emotional abuse, more than any of the others, does cut across each of the other areas. So if you've got a child that's being physically abused, sexually abused, or neglected, it's improbable, to say the least, that it's not having some impact on their well-being and mental health, etc. So there's some emotional abuse aspects of every single one of these. The reason for putting this slide up is just to give you that overview, but also as a reminder that governance is about compliance in one of its aspects, of course, and as Linda's already said, this safeguarding is about compliance. It's our responsibility as governors, and linked to that, we would strongly advocate all governing bodies accessing training on safeguarding and updating their knowledge on a regular basis. Now, obviously, we're preaching to the converted with you this morning, but Linda and I are certainly finding a lot of our time is taken up by delivering safeguarding training at whole governing body level now, because there is a growing recognition of the importance of governors making sure that their training is kept up to date in exactly the same way that we have an expectation of school staff.
And in the school where I'm a governor, our designated safeguarding lead. We're going to say more about that term in a moment so that you understand what that means. But the delivery of training to staff, she tailors that to a virtual delivery of safeguarding to governors, so that we understand both the legal framework, some of what we're sharing with you today, as well as the context through which our school is operating those processes. So it improves our knowledge of what systems and processes are in place, how they manage this. But we should never know as governors about individual children. We should never expect for those to be identified. The reason for sharing this overview with you is that it builds your background knowledge, which enables you to ask better informed questions and engage in discussions at a level where you've already got some knowledge, and therefore that conversation is enhanced and improved because you're already talking with that knowledge base in place. So let's move on to thinking about what changes have occurred. At the end of the document, there are 5 pages of changes. Many of those changes are changes to language or changes to just improve the way in which they're describing certain aspects of it, but there are some quite important changes. And so what we're going to do is not take you through all 5 pages of the changes, but to concentrate on the headlines of those changes. And we're going to look in a little bit more detail about the new duty on staff, not only to prevent harm, but to promote children's welfare. So this is not only about spotting those things that on the previous slide we might already have had in practice, but this is about how our staff are expected in schools to positively impact in promoting welfare. There's hints there absolutely to mental health. We've seen changes throughout the pandemic that all of us will recognise in terms of higher focus on that. And it does build on an already existing green paper about improving mental health in schools that existed before the pandemic. We've had a new curriculum for relationship, sex, health education. And there has been, again, notable and newsworthy increases in online sexual abuse and in increased reporting of quite serious sexual abuse in some schools and colleges through the Everyone's Invited website. So there are some important messages here. In order to prevent, then there has to be some promotion of those positive pieces of knowledge through the curriculum and some positive pieces of support for managing some of these conversations and situations for young people. So an important distinction there. Not completely unrelated, the increasing use of technology in all of our lives and the opportunity for good is absolutely proven, but there is also that opportunity for online grooming, online abuse, and a range of information being shared with young people that is not promoting their welfare. And so there is an expectation that all staff, when they have their induction into the role, online safety and the school's approach to that and the understanding of what those expectations are must be included in those induction sessions.
It's worth pointing out here, I think, that the DfE now has actually adopted a much more consistent approach in all of its publications. When they say must, that means there is a compulsion here in legislation. So it is a statutory requirement now. When it's not a statutory requirement, they will use the word should. So for those of you that perhaps are new to governance, you may not be aware of that, but this is an important aspect of change that's coming in this particular version of Keeping Children Safe. Sorry, Linda.
And again, where you've got must, it's a legal responsibility, therefore it's a compliance issue, so that it falls onto the governing body to ensure that that expectation has been met. The part 1 of the document is quite a lengthy document, so they've now also included a new Annex A, which is a condensed version of part 1. And this is could be used for those staff who are not working directly with children, so not having a classroom full of children every day. But again, this is a conversation, and you should understand with your school where they're proposing, which type of staff they're proposing has that more condensed version, and anybody who is child facing every day, it makes sense that they need that part one aspect put in place for them, because they're having to spot those signs and make those promotional adjustments to the way in which they're working with those children. And Annex A, but Annex B, which was that previous one, which is 40 pages in length, but has an annex with all those terms that I was talking about earlier, though that is the document that all staff who are working with children on a consistent basis should read, should understand, and should put in practice. So it's not just about, yes, I've had that document, thank you very much. But in order to hold the school to account, we do need to think about how do we know that staff have understood those requirements. Some of that training, those training sessions, and there is an annual requirement for staff training, should ensure that that is tested in some way. And of course, in our oversight as governors, in our safeguarding visits, possibly we might test that out. Excuse me. So let's have a look at that part one, what all staff must know. So again, as I was saying, excuse me, all staff should read at least this part of the guidance. And there is that additional content which talks about that terminology. And it is important that staff have a good grounding and understanding. So it's not just the document itself, but it is about that safeguarding induction training that ensures that the relevant parts of that are put across so that all staff understand what it is they need to do. And it's important, particularly for those staff who are working with children every day, for them to spot those subtle differences in the way in which children present and behave. And it's a very important role that is given to school staff, and it's one that we may think initially, well, you know, school staff have got a lot to do already, and it's about education. But arguably, staff at school are, next to the parents or carers, the most consistent group of individuals who see those children on a daily basis, and so are in the best position to spot those subtle changes and to promote those positive conversations and prevent concerns from escalating. So it's really important that we understand that children who are in difficult safeguarding positions will not be in a position to learn, and so those two things are connected to each other. Making sure we promote children's positive safety puts them in a better position to access learning. And then, as I said earlier, there are descriptors of the forms of abuse and neglect, and they are useful aids for governors in understanding that terminology. So Annex A, that's the new document. It's a much shorter document. It covers, and you know, we have, although there isn't a compulsion and expectation that governors should read part one, many do, and we would absolutely applaud any of those governors who, as part of their practices for governor induction, do point in that direction. There's no compulsion for that, but Annex A possibly is the annex that might be used for caretakers, for cleaners if they're employed directly by the school, for those people that may not be facing the same group of children on a regular basis, but need to understand the basics. There is a responsibility on all of us if we see that something that troubles us about a child, that we understand where we need to go to report that concern. It may be insignificant, but it needs to be reported, and the overview by that designated safeguarding lead about collecting information like that ensures that no little pieces of information about a child that would build a stronger picture to support more action isn't taken. So it's important that all staff have that basic understanding of what safeguarding means and understand how they are able to use that understanding to inform any concerns that they have, any practice that they may need to adopt in their own work during the day.
But a question has come in, Linda, from Caroline, and Caroline's saying, can we give some examples of the sort of questions governors could ask staff when visiting to check that they are promoting well-being and have, as you said, read and actually understood the guidance?
If you look at the very beginning part of the guidance, it does talk about the sorts of things that need to be in place. So you could ask staff about what their induction training consisted of. What would they do if they had a concern? So you can test that they've understood how they raise a concern. You could ask them what sort of things they're expected to do as a member of staff in order to promote those conversations with children. You think about, and all schools are different, so the context of your school and the way and what age group of children, if there is form time, there may be conversations and elements of that are taken up in form time. It's just to have that discussion informed by what's at the beginning of part one that they should know. You can then formulate your own questions to build your body of knowledge, but also you're testing whether that staff member has engaged with it and can enter into that dialogue with that information in their head. Steve, I know you deliver safeguarding training to school staff, and so you may have an extra little piece of information that's helpful there.
Well, the only thing I would add to that, Linda, is that I would agree wholeheartedly with what you've said. But I think as governors, don't forget, it's not our role to go in and test staff, so to speak. So what we should do, and Linda and I invariably use the phrase, the role of governors, you can sum up in those 4 words. What we do is we ensure by seeking assurance. So what we would expect is that the leadership team, the designated safeguarding lead, etc., they would be hopefully monitoring safeguarding on an ongoing basis. So they would actually be receiving that, doing that ensuring, and then can report back to governors. Nothing to stop us when we're in school or on virtual meetings with school staff asking those questions as Linda, but please don't think that we're advocating that it's for us as governors to start testing staff as to what their level of knowledge or application is, because that's not really the case. But certainly the expectation is the leadership team of the school, the head, the designated safeguarding lead, they would be doing that on our behalf anyway.
And I think the biggest fear staff have in school of governor visits is that they're going to be given some kind of test or exam by governors. I would always suggest that a visit is built around a theme, and it becomes a dialogue. So you have some information in your head and you are testing that information in a conversation, and you'll get a lot more from the visit by being well informed and focusing around a theme, and also the staff member or members that you're visiting will be able to have a better conversation with you because of that.
And there's another question from Anthony, Linda. This is one for you. Anthony's saying, Linda mentioned that this being relevant to staff such as cleaners. He's talking about Annex A, of course. If employed directly by the school, what are the expectations, responsibilities of the governing body in relation to third-party contractors working on site? I mean, I would say on that one that it is the responsibility of the school, therefore the governing body, to ensure anybody who is coming onto site, particularly if they've got access to children and young people in the school, then we need some assurance that they've been safe, been through safer recruitment processes, but they are aware of the school's safeguarding procedures, etc. So I would say exactly the same case if we have contract cleaners as opposed to those employed directly.
And your designated safeguarding lead in school will usually make sure that anybody who is visiting the school, there are procedures for those visitors to understand what those measures need to be and what they need to know about the school. And also any contractors, you may have groups that run provision, like sports provisions and clubs after school, sports and a variety of different craft clubs increasingly are run by third parties. And again, they are working often with pupils from your school. And so there should be some measures in place to ensure that they meet the standards for employing their own staff, but also they understand the expectations from our own safeguarding policies. Okay, so just some other key messages from part one. There is that recognition that there are families, there are children who potentially are beginning to show some signs here of requiring some additional support for their mental health. This is all part of that continuum of better support for children in their mental health and well-being outlined in a previous green paper that without the pandemic would have been fully in place by 2025, but that this is the beginnings of this happening in school under this banner of safeguarding, that this now includes mental health of the child, but also the impact of the family on those aspects as well. I mentioned earlier the significant increase in the use of technology in society as a whole, but there are some significant issues here with the use of technology. If we think of probably the one that springs to mind most readily is online bullying. And if we think of the safeguarding issues that are related to that, both in terms of emotional health and mental health, there are other aspects of that with online grooming and radicalization, but these are significant, in each of these cases, significant safeguarding issues. So we do need to be aware of, and it is included, online safety is included for these reasons, because to make sure that we are promoting positive use of technology, as well as making sure that we are supporting young people who are possibly drawn into some of these issues. Child sexual exploitation, again, there's been an increasing amount of content in the document to cover this, because sadly this is an increasing area of safeguarding incidents for young people, and technology has played its part in that, but we've also seen a huge rise in the number of cases that are coming to attention nationally. And then that Annex B, there is much more information there around some of this terminology, and there is an expectation that staff will familiarise themselves through that lens of context of the school and expectations and the delivery of safeguarding training to staff, that they'll familiarise themselves and they'll understand what their expectations and responsibilities are. And I know in my own school, because this is a large subject, what they have done at the beginning of this year is they've talked about it through the lens of the context in the school, and then they'll be delivering more content throughout the year, deepening all staff's knowledge in some of these areas that aren't so evident in our school at the moment. So again, it may be that you come across an approach that looks somewhat similar.
We've got a few questions on the panel on this one, Linda. One on this slide, I should say. Anne-Marie is actually asking or making a comment that she heard yesterday there's a 45-week delay in accessing child mental health services. I think that varies dramatically up and down the country, Anne-Marie. Many governors will be aware, very often it's the services referred to as CAMS, which is child and adolescent mental health services. Lots of areas have invested more money in that in the last couple of years or so, and those lead times are actually shortening. But yes, that's a sad reality of life at the moment, unfortunately. And again, the pandemic has probably hit those, certainly in some of the big inner city areas, more than most. Michelle is asking...
Can I just add to that, Steve?
Sorry, Linda.
Just add to that, that part of this delivery of the green paper on mental health was aimed to see mental health leads in school actively supporting that early help aspect. And the DfE have just restarted that programme of training. So there is training available for those mental health leads. And although it doesn't resolve the issue that Anne-Marie mentioned, and that is about those referrals when children are often in quite desperate need of support, this is about trying to promote and prevent some of those early help children developing into needing that help at a later stage. So ensuring or asking a question around, have we put anybody through the training, or is anybody from our school or academy going on that training as a designated mental health lead, would be helpful in order to try and prevent some of this escalating later for some of these children. You're muted, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. There's one other question from Simone, and Simone is asking, with child sexual exploitation, what sort of things should governors be looking out for in school discussion here? I think the key is absolutely that, Simone. It is about discussion. It's not something that we should look to question ourselves on, but certainly in meetings, asking about what is the school doing to make staff aware of some of the potential indicators of child sexual exploitation. Governors could be asking, for example, as the last bullet point says here, you've now got several pages of information on child sexual exploitation in Annex B. Has that been shared with staff? Have they read it? Have they got any questions on it? Those are the sorts of lines of inquiry I think we ought to be following, I would suggest.
So there are some questions that we might formulate our discussions around and know how the school is approaching these. And what we might be looking at here is, what is our policy? What is the school's or academy's policy? Every individual school within an academy should have its own safeguarding policy, because the context varies from one school to another. There will be some shared approaches, certainly, but there should be separate policies for each school. But what is our school or academy's policy around which groups of staff are required to read part 1 and understand it, and which staff would be suitable for Annex A? We need, as governors, to have that understanding of how the school leadership team, designated safeguarding lead, might ensure that all staff do understand their responsibilities, what to look for, what the indicators are, how to report concerns, how to escalate concerns. And we also need to know, as governors, how have all these key messages for all staff been communicated across the staff since the beginning of September. So in many schools and academies, there'll be inset days at the beginning of the autumn term, and that is traditionally the time in which safeguarding training is delivered, that annual safeguarding training, using the changes in the Keeping Children Safe in Education document as a basis for that. There have been some big changes. I've mentioned my school is doing it in a proportionate way across the year because it wasn't possible to do all of that in one go. I think that's a sensible approach. We know that as governors because it was reported in our head teachers report. So it's about understanding from the information that you've been provided by the school, what is your understanding? Do you need to clarify any of that information by asking questions based on what you now know from this session or your reading and research of the documents that we're sharing with you today? Steve, I'll hand over.
Sorry, Linda.
hand over to you at this point.
Thank you. Okay, folks, so we're moving on to part 2 of the guidance now. And part 2 is crucial for us as governors to actually have an understanding and an overview of, because this is the aspect that, although it talks about management, which is a word we don't often use with regard to governance, this talks about the responsibilities of governing bodies. And where it says proprietors there, you can see on the second line down, that just means the trust board in an academy, because they're referred to as the proprietors, and management committees is the term used for governance in pupil referral units, special schools sometimes, etc. And the key here, of course, is that this is about our responsibilities. Linda mentioned compliance right at the start of the session, and I think it's really important that as governors, we recognise we have some very significant responsibilities here. We talked about the word must. You will see in this paragraph that I'm just highlighting for you now that must is actually highlighted in bold on 2 separate occasions here. So the first must is about our role as governors in ensuring that schools comply with their duties under legislation. And then the second one is about having regard to this particular guidance. So there's a lot of things that we've already touched on. There'll be more that we're going to come to in this next section, which talks about changes this year. And we have a responsibility as governors to ensure that those changes in this particular statutory guidance have an informing role as regards to policies. And I don't just mean safeguarding policy, but other policies in the school's procedures, and of course the way in which that training is actually developed, so that we are aware that not only do we comply with what the law said last year, but we know about how it's changing on a constant basis, and we keep our own knowledge up to speed as part of that as well. Okay, I wanted to start off just by giving a little bit of clarification here, because certainly the help desk that we run on Better Governor has been inundated in the first few weeks of the new version of Keeping Children Safe by people reading this paragraph that's on the screen now. You can see it's paragraph 80, and this says governors and proprietors should have a senior board level or equivalent lead to take leadership responsibility. A lot of people have been a bit confused by this, and it doesn't surprise us. I think that's hideously misleading, and I would suggest that anybody that reads that paragraph needs to read on, because if you come to paragraph 89, it explains totally that all that paragraph 80 means is that we have a responsibility as governors in our schools to ensure that there is a designated safeguarding lead in role, and that they are a senior member of staff, preferably on the leadership team. So if anybody says to you, oh, we've got to have a governor who's actually taking the lead for safeguarding the school, that's not what that first paragraph means. It's not worded the most appropriate way in my view, but again, don't be misled by it, please. Okay, so in terms of the rest of part 2, what we've done again is actually just picked out the key changes, those that we think are most relevant to those of us actually in school governance. Oops, sorry, I've gone forward. Well, I didn't mean to there. The first one is about policies. And again, Linda and I spent quite a lot of our time conducting safeguarding audits in schools. And one of the things that we very often find is that certainly in multi-academy trusts now, there has been a growing tendency for those trusts to have trust-wide policies on aspects of school operations, such as behaviour and safeguarding. And what Keeping Children Safe does now is absolutely make it crystal clear that individual schools must, and again it's a must, have their own safeguarding and behaviour policies. And the rationale behind that is, of course, that no 2 schools are the same, no 2 children in schools are the same. Therefore, what we have to do is think about our context as governors, think about the context of our schools, and ensure that that context in terms of the types of pupils that we get in, the types of communities that our schools are serving, the needs of those pupils that are coming into school, all of those things are reflected in our safeguarding and behaviour policies. Now, there can be a template policy that is then adapted for each individual school. That's perfectly fine, but each school must have its own policy. You can't have a trust-wide policy anymore. It is a responsibility now of the designated safeguarding lead, because as we said on the previous slide, what you have in part 2 is information for the governing board in terms of its responsibilities, but also for the designated safeguarding lead, that person in the school who leads on safeguarding. And in many primary schools, that will possibly be the head teacher. In secondary schools, it's less likely to be the head, I would suggest. And what we have to think about is that the designated safeguarding lead is that person who is in school on a day-to-day basis, and therefore, of course, what they're doing is having that complete overview. Our role as governors, even if we're the designated safeguarding governor, that's actually about strategic overview, and the two are very different. We've also got the designated safeguarding lead now having to take responsibility for online safety as well as all other aspects of safeguarding. Linda's already mentioned the necessity now, and again it's a bit of a compulsion, to ensure that online safety is included in induction training for all new members of staff, but this is saying that the designated safeguarding lead has to take lead responsibility for online safety. That may have sat previously in your schools with perhaps somebody like a subject lead for IT. Now, that's something to think about, but what we need to be ensuring is this is not just about how it is taught in schools, this is also about how governing boards ensure that the safety side of online activity is given sufficient responsibility. I can see we've got a couple of questions come up on the panel here. Who should be responsible? Andrew's asking, who should be responsible for ensuring all after-hours school classes are up to speed with legislation, as they're often subcontracted? I think that's a good question, Andrew. With anything that's done as a subcontracted activity, there is a responsibility on the school in terms of ensuring that these are fit and proper people to lead activities with your children, but it is perfectly reasonable for the school to ask for confirmation from the contractor that their staff, for example, have been through appropriately safe recruitment processes and that their training has actually been kept up to date. Certainly one of the schools where I'm chair, surprisingly, as Linda's already mentioned, I'm a safeguarding trainer. I actually do the safeguarding training there. We invite all of our after school clubs to come along to that so that they have the same training as our school staff do. It's not mandatory, it's just a way of doing it.
The other thing I'd mentioned there, Steve, is that often with primary after school clubs, they will employ some of the same staff that work with the children during the day, teaching assistants and the like, to increase the number of hours that they have available to them. And the children know those individuals. So they may also have received training within the school's remit anyway, but the designated safeguarding lead for the school should ensure that any organisation who is delivering child face-to-face services has met those safeguarding expectations.
Anna Teresa's put a question on saying, can you expand a bit more on the IT lead stroke DSL for online safety? What I say about there being sort of two elements of it really, Anna Teresa, is that historically, I think there's been a situation in our schools where the subject lead for IT has also had a responsibility for online safety. They'll teach a little bit of online safety, obviously, to children. Because of the pandemic, what's happened is that online safety has become a bigger issue, of course, for very obvious reasons. And therefore now the responsibility for the school's overall approach to online safety, both from a response to incidents, but also ensuring that the curriculum is appropriate, now sits with the designated safeguarding lead. The IT lead still has a role to play, of course, but theirs isn't necessarily all-encompassing of the safeguarding elements, and that's the only point that we're making on that, really.
I noticed a couple of people have asked about a copy of the slides. I think you'll find that they were put in right at the head of the chat. If you go right to the beginning of the chat, you'll find that there is a copy of the slides attached there.
Okay, let's move on. So Apologies for my abbreviation here. Significant additional content is what I should say on peer-on-peer sexual abuse. Linda's already mentioned that, so I don't want to say any more about that here. But again, important from the governance perspective that this is about the leadership of this particular aspect. So there's information that is relevant to the role of the designated safeguarding lead. But again, as governors, we would be wanting to seek assurance that knowledge of this really important aspect is where it should be in our schools. There is a complete new section on teaching safeguarding, and that, of course, does include the online safety. And the point that is made here is that the Keeping Children Safe document is not intended as a one-size-fits-all. In other words, the expectation, not just in terms of the DFE and putting Keeping Children Safe together, but Ofsted, when they come and inspect our schools as well, will expect the curriculum to be adapted to meet the needs of all pupils. And of course, equality of access to the curriculum is a key function. Not key function, a key priority, I should say, rather, in all Ofsted inspections now. And we've touched on this a little bit already in terms of the use of school premises. There is an expectation that governing boards have a responsibility to ensure that we are letting our premises to fit and proper people, particularly those that are actually offering activities directed at our own children. There's more information on elective home education and some of the safeguards around that. And that's really as a response to the fact there's been a dramatic increase in the number of parents and carers electing to home educate their own children. And of course, we've already mentioned mental health, but there's a lot in this section, in part 2, about the role that the designated safeguarding lead plays here. And Linda's talked about that quite a lot already, so I won't go into any more detail. So just a couple of questions really that I would suggest are relevant for us to focus on as governors here. The first one is that compliance question. Are we aware of the changes and all of those aspects where it's preceded by a must? Have they been implemented? Are they actually understood by everybody in school? And the second one is really, is keeping children safe in education as a document on the agenda for our meetings this term, because governors need that assurance that the changes have been implemented, but governors also need, as we've already said this morning, to be up to speed themselves in terms of knowing how significant some of those changes are and what's happened in the last 12 months and how that affects the landscape as far as safeguarding is concerned going forward. Zoe's asked a question: what safeguarding considerations should we consider where we have children at home at the moment? I think that's a good question, Zoe. It doesn't change really from where we were on and off, of course, in all of those partial school closure programs from last year, because we know that where children at the moment, it'll be those either who've actually got symptoms and are isolating or perhaps have COVID, or we may still have a small number of children who are self-isolating from a sort of shielding type perspective. The risks there are mainly, they're twofold. For some children who are considered vulnerable anyway, spending more time in the home environment is a consideration, of course, and you would expect your designated safeguarding lead to be very aware of who those children families are. And the second one, of course, comes back to online activity. Where children are learning at home at the moment, for whatever reason, they are by necessity spending more time in an online environment, we're assuming, and therefore we have to be mindful of the increased risks there. Okay, so let's move on at that stage and think about sorry. Sorry, we've got a few additional questions here. I've went the wrong way on my slides. I do apologise. I think it's important from our perspective as governors to actually seek that assurance that staff have actually received that training. Lots of your schools will have done inset training early in September, of course. Did that include all of the new aspects of keeping children safe? Have we changed our induction training for new staff? particularly they're thinking, of course, about the online safety. And again, but coming back to that question, when did we last make sure that as a governing body, we updated our own training? Sorry, that's where I thought I was going a few moments ago. I've caught up with myself now. I do apologise. Part 3 is the area that's about safer recruitment. This is an area that has actually changed quite dramatically in the way in which it looks. It's put on a lot of weight since the 2020 version of Keeping Children Safe. But to be perfectly honest, most of the changes here are cosmetic. And the reason I say that is because the legal framework underpinning safer recruitment in schools has not changed at all. All we've got really is a reformatting of it, additional quite valuable information in some places, but nothing has changed in terms of our responsibilities. So what we have got, I think, is perhaps a more logical flow to the system now. So we've got 4 sections within part 3. Recruitment and selection processes is the first one, and that of course includes all of those things that we should do in terms of advertising, job profiles, all of those things, and the importance of safeguarding references there. Helpful section on pre-appointment checks in terms of single central record, etc. There's some updated guidance on the other checks, and as Linda mentioned very briefly earlier, the January 2020 version of Keeping Children Safe was changed to reflect the fact that we'd come out of the European Union, and the right to work in the UK checks have changed a little bit, and they were actually a very key part and a driver for that. What you will also see in there is a new section which is talking about the responsibility. And again, it's a responsibility on governing bodies, but it's another one of those ones we ensure by seeking assurance. If the school has reason to discipline somebody for safeguarding reasons, then they have a statutory duty to report that to the Disclosure and Barring Service. And that's an important responsibility that as governors we have to ensure is actually being lived and breathed in our schools. Key messages from section 3, or part 3 rather, is that governing bodies' responsibility here is to ensure that those who are involved with recruitment of staff have received safer recruitment training. Now, that particular bullet point is in italics. That's a direct quote from Keeping Children Safe. And the important element of this is that safer recruitment training, it now has to be based on part 3 of Keeping Children Safe. And that's why you will have seen that the NSPCC have recently updated their training. That's to reflect the slight change in direction here. There is a reminder that, and significantly more information given on when we are shortlisting candidates. It is the expectation now that the shortlisted candidates should be required to complete a self-declaration about their criminal record. And that's as much about efficiency and administration and anything else. You give them the opportunity to make a self-declaration, because if they declare something that would actually make them unsuitable to work with children, you don't want to go through that process of shortlisting and interviewing, etc. It's also a safety check, of course. When you do, if you were to appoint it, you were to go to a DBS check, a Disclosure and Barring Service check, you ensure that it matches what was actually declared on that self-declaration form. And I mentioned the single central record a few moments ago. Page 66 has actually got a very helpful checklist. It's all in one place. So if any governors are actually taking that responsibility to monitor the single central record, which we would regard as good practice, there's a helpful checklist there in paragraph 253 that you can actually use in terms of checking the appropriate content is in place. And of course, the key message there is, from a governance perspective, safer recruitment probably hasn't been on the agenda much in the last 19, 20 months or so for obvious reasons. But when was it last put on our agenda? Because it ought to be. It's something that governors need to be aware of. Those governors who are involved in recruiting head teachers and deputy head teachers must have completed safer recruitment training themselves in order to participate, of course. Okay, that brings us on to part 4 of the document, and part 4 is the section that actually deals with allegations. This has changed quite dramatically. When we say allegations, we mean allegations against members of staff, and that could be paid or unpaid staff, of course. It's grown from 6 to 19 pages. That's primarily because of a lot of new content here. What the new version has done is split this now into two sections and actually made the distinction between allegations, and of course an allegation is where somebody has been accused of putting a child at significant risk of harm. They've either done something or said something, or their actions have potentially harmed a child, and therefore meet what is referred to as the harms threshold, and full explanation is given of this in Keeping Children Safe. And then below that level, where things don't meet the harm threshold, it's referred to as concerns. And Linda and I were talking about this earlier this morning, and the example that I tend to give people here is a concern would be if the school policy is members of staff, and this would be good practice from a safeguarding, members of staff should not use their mobile phones in front of children and young people in schools. If you see somebody using a mobile phone in school, that is a concern. There's a safeguarding concern there. If you were to see somebody using their mobile phone taking photographs of children changing for PE, that clearly is an allegation. That clearly has crossed that boundary. And it's that kind of thing. There are lots of examples actually given in Keeping Children Safe. So if this is an area you want to find out a little bit more about, please do have a look at that section 4. As I said, there's not 19 pages to read there. So it's a fairly weighty tome. It does go into quite a lot of detail. And again, thinking about that statutory duty to ensure that our policies are up to date, we would need to, as governors, hopefully be asking the question or reflect on the question, does our safeguarding policy reflect this distinction? But also, lots of local authorities do maintain schools, and very often they're adopted by academy trusts as well, with a management of allegations procedure. Again, that does need to be updated now to reflect the changes in part 4. And that brings us on to part 5. And part 5 is not a new section. This was in the previous version of Keeping Children Safe, but it is a new layout, and there is certainly additional content here. Part 5 is the section on peer-on-peer sexual abuse. And as Linda's already said, this is one which has seen a mushrooming of concern in the last 12 months or so. Linda mentioned Everyone's Invited website. The response to that actually went viral in February this year. That led to lots and lots of schools being named there. That sparked the interest of the Department for Education. They then asked Ofsted to do a research project on it, and I think most of you will be aware of the outcomes of that. This has raised the profile significantly. There is a key expectation here now that all schools are aware of those concerns and are actually acting on them. And the idea of acting on them is there is a very clear expectation from the Department for Education now, and that's being followed up in terms of Ofsted inspections as well. And the expectation is, even if your school is not on that list on the Everyone's Invited website, don't think that means it couldn't happen in your school. What is happening now is that the expectation is saying, assume it's happening and think about, are there unreported concerns in your school? There is a very real expectation that schools have to respond to every single report of sexual abuse, sexual violence in school, and every concern that a child or young person actually may come to, because there is significant evidence that's been put on the it's anecdotal evidence, of course, on the Everyone's Invited website that says a lot of things that were reported by children in schools historically weren't taken seriously. There is a very clear expectation that's not acceptable anymore, of course. And there is a recommendation that Part 5 is looked at and read in conjunction with the detailed guidance provided by the DfE. That was updated in August, and I think I've put on the question panel already to a couple of you that we've got some URLs for the key documents. That's one of them on our penultimate slide for you this morning. And again, question to reflect on at the bottom there. In your school, in your trust, is the profile of peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence as high as it should be? Because it should be. There is a very real expectation on the part of the department now that we are all aware of what's happening out there in the big wide world, and that there are an awful lot of people who felt that the responses they got when they were in school weren't appropriate, and that's something that we can't allow to continue. Sorry, I think that's the apologies, folks. I sent the slides across to governors for schools yesterday. I realised I'd left an extra one in there. That's a rogue slide, so ignore that. I do apologise. That brings us to the end of what we wanted to actually share with you this morning. We've got one or two questions which we'll just scan down the panel now. But if there are any unanswered questions at the end of this session, what we will do is actually go through the report and get back to you individually if we haven't done so during the session itself, because apart from anything else, I am very aware that we've only got a minute left of our time. Paul is asking, is there a list of musts available? No, there isn't really, Peter, but what we've tried to do, as I say, Linda and I have spent a lot of time reading and distilling the new version. I hope we've encapsulated all of the ones that are significant and relevant to school governance in what we've actually been given you today. Paul is asking, do schools now have to report any formal safeguarding investigation to the Teaching Regulation Agency, even if a member of staff is found not guilty? That's a great question, Paul. I have to admit, I don't know the answer offhand. I will go away and look into that one. I think we'll probably have to make this the last question because of time, but this is probably one that has got appeal to a lot of you, and there's quite a few questions on the similar theme relating to the single central record. I'm just picking one here from Corinna, and Corinna is actually asking, I'm responsible for the single central record checking. Can you please advise how we should handle DBS renewals? That's a fascinating question. It's a perennial one. In reality, as far as the law is concerned, there is no such thing as a DBS renewal. It is a check that should be conducted on appointment, on engagement in the school. Many local authorities, by custom and practice, said that they should be renewed every 3 years. What we tend to talk about, and what I particularly focus on when I'm doing safeguarding training for staff, is what we should have in place after all of those safer recruitment checks have been done when someone's appointed, is a culture of vigilance in schools that actually means that everybody is transparent in what they do, we're honest, we display integrity in the way we conduct our roles, and actually that is monitored by the designated safeguarding lead, and all staff through the whistleblowing policy should be mindful of their responsibilities on that. So you don't have to update the DBS at all unless you change jobs or unless you've had a break in service. So when you're looking at a single central record, DBSs have only been in place since 2006, 2007. That is the date by which you may see some entries in your single central record. That's perfectly acceptable. That was either on appointment or when the regulations came in. Okay, as I say, apologies that we haven't answered your specific question, but we've got a lot of people on the call this morning, which is fantastic. As promised, that's the slide that's got the URLs for the 2 key documents that we've referred to. And just want to finish off this morning by saying a very big thank you for joining us. Thank you for all of those questions. If we haven't answered yours, we will do directly to you after the event. So thank you very much indeed for giving up your time today. Linda and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. We hope to see you again at upcoming Governors for Schools webinars that we're hosting as Better Governor. But in the meantime, look after yourselves and stay safe. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.